Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 118, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I didn't think I was going to get a lot of sewing done this week, but I actually did a few projects, and I'll talk about those in a bit. First, I want to mention that I am going to be out of town the week that this podcast drops, so I'm recording it ahead of time so that it posts while I'm traveling, but there won't be one the following week because I get back late Monday night. On Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central, April 21st, 2026, I am presenting a webinar for Living Free in Tennessee. Some of you may have heard me talk about Nicole Sauce and her Living Free in Tennessee podcast. I have been listening to that podcast for a long time. It's probably the only podcast that I have listened to consistently over the years. I started way back at episode number 8, and she's up to episode 1000 and something. So it's been quite a while. I've also been to her spring workshop that she hosts at her homestead in Tennessee, and I've been at Self-Reliance Festival, which she is also a big part of. She asked me to do a member webinar for the LFTN members on April 21st, but here's the great thing. It's not only open to LFTN members. You can sign up even if you're not a member. It's free to members, but if you're not a member, it's $35. So you can go to the Living Free in Tennessee website. I will put the link in the show notes and sign up there. I'll be doing a presentation on sewing for the homestead, or basic sewing skills that you need if you are living on a homestead. But honestly, you could be living on a homestead in the city, truly. These are sewing skills that everyone can use, and I hope that you'll join us for the webinar. I spent most of my week this week on a painting project over at our rental house. My husband and I own the piece of property directly adjacent to our primary residence, and the rental house property is where the garden and the greenhouse are and the pig pasture. And the rental house had been rented out for about 10 years, but our renters moved out last June, and we haven't re-rented the house. We're keeping it mostly as a guest house for friends and family. I have some friends coming to stay for a month this summer, and last year a tree fell on the house. My husband patched up the roof, but one of the branches had come through the ceiling in the spare bedroom, so he put some plywood over it, and it's needed to be fixed for a while. And this winter that was one of the projects on his list. And I told him that if he patched up the ceiling, I would do the painting. So he finished that last week and got everything taped and masked off for me, and I was in there painting this week. That spare bedroom is the room that my friend who's coming to stay for a month this summer uses as her sewing room. And now it's all freshly painted and looks much better, and there's no hole in the ceiling. So I hope she has fun working in there. I do need to make some curtains for that room, and I will probably put that on the list for later this spring. I did do some sewing yesterday, though. I had a stack of projects for the Juki 1541S, my industrial machine. One of my friends is the floor manager for a local boutique, and she occasionally brings me items and asks me to repair them. And she brought me a tote bag, a leather tote bag, and the strap had ripped where it connected to the top of the bag, and she said, "Can you sew this back on?" So I said I would try, but I went to put the bag back together yesterday, and for some reason, I don't know whether there's a piece of plastic in there or what, but even that Juki 1541 won't go through it, and I don't want to damage my machine. So if I try to sew something and the safety goes off, then I know that I can't do that. So I had to tell her that I couldn't fix that tote bag, but I had 2 other projects to do. One of our employees this week brought me a sling for his rifle and wanted to know if I could modify it a little bit. And he showed me what he wanted. And I looked at it and I said that, yes, I thought I could do that. So I made the modification, even though I've never done this before. And it turned out really well, and he's very happy with it. And then the last project that I worked on was the Can Do Patterns Retro Sling. And this is a cautionary tale. I don't want you to do this. This is kind of ridiculous. I started that project, I think, end of last summer. I worked on it over the fall, and then I set it aside. And it literally had 3 seams left to sew, and it was done. And I just kept moving it around my sewing room. So yesterday when I was out in the garage working on the Juki, I got that project out. Literally all I had to do was bind the inside seam that I had already sewn, sew the other piece to the gusset, and bind that seam, and it was done. It took me about 45 minutes. So don't let projects languish when they're just a few feet or even just a few inches from the finish line. I could have been using that bag. I really like it. I like the size of it. I made it out of some red waxed canvas. The pattern was very well done and easy to follow, and I would make it again. I have been cutting out and prepping some patterns so that when I finally do get a chance to get back into the sewing room and have a good chunk of time to work, I will have some projects prepped and ready to go. I ran across a very interesting sewing-related article this week, and it is the inspiration behind today's podcast topic. The article is on the ABC News website, and I will put a link to it in the show notes. It is about the lack of professionally trained and skilled sewists in the United States. The people who have been doing tailoring and alterations are aging and retiring, and very few replacements are coming up through the ranks. And one of the things that I found most interesting in this article was a mention that Nordstrom has partnered with the Fashion Institute of Technology to create a 9-week advanced sewing and tailoring class. They got 200 applications for the first cohort of this class. They chose 15 of the applicants to take the class, and of those 15 who finished and were certified in February, Nordstrom has hired or offered jobs to 10 of them. I mentioned that to my younger daughter, who's a buyer at Nordstrom, and she said that yes, it sounds like it's been a very successful program for them. So I'm hoping that they continue it and that they also expand it. Nordstrom has an alterations department in virtually every single one of its stores. I've used them. I purchased a dress for a wedding a few years ago, and I needed to have it altered, so I took it to them. It took them about a week. They altered it perfectly, and I was able to wear the dress to the wedding. And I'm telling you that I used their alteration service because it was just a little too complicated for me, and I didn't want to mess up the dress. But I was reading that article and thinking, there's been so much in the news lately about AI taking everyone's jobs, but there are some jobs that are never going to be able to be replaced by AI. And certainly a skilled sewist is going to have plenty of opportunities to make money. So I thought I would devote today's podcast episode to ways that you can make money from your sewing. As someone who has a tendency to turn my hobbies into businesses, I will tell you that this can be a two-edged sword, and you may not want to do this. but it can also be a good side hustle. If you are dedicated and skilled and willing to work hard, I think you absolutely could support yourself with sewing. But we're going to talk about all the different ways that you can make money from your hobby. So the first way is the one that I just talked about, which is alterations and repairs. One of the funny things I've discovered is that when people just find out that you can sew, you get asked to do all sorts of things. Everything from hemming pants to making generator covers to modifying rifle slings. So you may find yourself with an alterations and repair business even if you didn't set out to create one. Some people enjoy this kind of work. It's never the same. You get all sorts of different kinds of projects. Some people find it nerve-wracking. It's a risk to work on something that belongs to somebody else, and if you mess it up, it's on you. You also have to be very clear about your pricing. People expect you to hem pants for free or for next to nothing. If it were that easy, they'd be doing it themselves. So don't be afraid to ask for a reasonable price for your skilled labor. You've invested in the machinery, in the thread, in the learning the skills that you need to do your job, and there's absolutely no reason why anyone should expect you to do that work for free. There are different ways to set up an alterations and repair business. You can work for yourself, or you can work for somebody else. There may be a dry cleaning facility or business in your town. I know that occasionally the one here in Kalispell has advertised for someone to work for them doing alterations and repairs. And if you're really ambitious, you can go to work for someplace like Nordstrom. So that's the first way, and I think probably one of the primary ways that sewists can support themselves is doing alterations and repair. The second one is producing goods for sale. I've interviewed several people on this podcast, most recently Christina last week, who owns Bumbleroot Design, who makes handmade bags. This doesn't just have to be bags. This can go in a lot of different directions. You could find a local boutique, maybe one that does work on consignment, and make items for them. Christina talked about making home dec items and aprons before she got into bags. You could sell your items at farmers markets. We have an organization here called Artists and Craftsmen of the Flathead, and they have several big sales throughout the year. I belong to a little craft co-op of about, I'd say 30 members, and we put on a sale at the end of September every year. This kind of production sewing works well if you make repeatable items and you get to be known for certain items. I have my friend that's coming to stay for a month this summer, who started a sewing business where she was selling items at farmers markets and then transitioned that into a custom embroidery business. And I'm hoping that she and I can have a conversation for the podcast this summer, Dina, if you're listening, and we can talk about how that business is going for her, because she's built it into something pretty spectacular. The downside to this, and this is something that I suffer from, I can't do production because I get bored silly making the same thing over and over again. Some people don't. Some people like to churn out multiples of the same item, especially if they're slightly different. Maybe they use a different fabric or different trims. I'm just not a production person. Maybe you would like to produce patterns. And if this is something that you're thinking about doing, I have a whole lot of advice for you. My first piece of advice is look at really well done patterns in the area where you want to publish patterns. So if you want to publish quilt patterns, Look at quilt patterns that you think are particularly well done. If you want to publish bag patterns, same thing. Look at bag patterns that are extremely well done. I'm not advocating that you copy those styles, but you need to be familiar with the kind of information that needs to be presented. When I first started writing knitting patterns, my mentor, Jean Lampe, at the Knitting Guild of America, told me that I should try to write instructions for someone to tie their shoes. At the time that she gave me that advice, back in the early 2000s, there was no internet or YouTube or anything like that. Putting pictures into a document was not as easy as it is now. So you might say, well, I'll just use a lot of pictures. That's fine. But you should also try doing it without pictures and explain every part of the process down to what is a shoelace. It's a very educational and humbling experience. If you are going to write instructions and produce patterns, I highly suggest getting testers, getting people to work through your patterns, and get people with different styles of working. People who follow directions to the letter and people who kind of wing it. You're going to get different input from different kinds of sewists. The good thing about this kind of production is that you produce it once and it can generate revenue for a long time. I am still selling copies of my finishing book that I wrote 30 years ago. It is a great way to generate passive income. If you can find an underserved market and you can set yourself up as someone who knows not only the craft but can communicate that well through patterns, you can develop quite a business. The next area where you might be able to make some money with your sewing is one that is near and dear to my heart, and that is teaching. I never thought that I would end up doing as much teaching as I do, but I enjoy it so much. It's very rewarding. When I started back in the early 2000s, it was done mostly by traveling around the country. I went to a lot of national conventions, regional conventions. I taught for a lot of guilds. I taught for stores. Now there are platforms for teaching where you can develop classes and teach them over and over again without actually being physically present. You can teach online live. You can offer memberships to ongoing classes or sew-alongs. There are many creative ways to structure this. I often get asked why I don't have online classes, and mostly it's because I can't figure out how to cram any more hours into my days. And I also don't have a really good place right now to do any filming. That might change. It occurred to me after painting the spare bedroom over at our rental house that it might actually make a good filming area. So I think I might explore that a little bit more. If you think you might like to teach sewing, look in your community for ways to do that, maybe through the local community college. Ours offers a lot of craft courses, maybe through one of your local fabric or quilt stores. And just because it's a quilt store doesn't mean that they won't let you teach other things. Our quilt stores let me teach garment classes and bag making classes. I found that one good way to get your foot in the door is to go to the owner of the store and say, do you have any classes you'd like to offer for which you need a teacher? That's how I ended up teaching at the quilt store, because I asked the owner if she needed a teacher for anything, and she said, do you know how to use a serger? And I said, yes, and she said, I need a serger teacher. You should have a fairly good grasp of the basics, but you can learn as you go too. There's this concept of just staying one page ahead of the students. And lots of teachers I know have done that. You just need to be flexible and willing to learn. Once you've been teaching at the local level, it's much easier to parlay that into teaching at a regional conference like Sew Expo or a national conference. Maybe you become a brand ambassador, or you know a lot about a particular brand of machine. So I have Bernina machines, and I teach the Bernina mastery classes at our local store and also at the quilt store in Missoula, which is also a Bernina dealer. The next idea is kind of related to alterations and repairs, but it's not quite the same. It's custom sewing or taking on commissions. So maybe you set yourself up as someone who can do t-shirt quilts, and you could offer that in a lot of different formats, either start to finish or quilting an already completed t-shirt quilt top. If you have a long arm machine or are willing to invest in one, you can take in all sorts of custom quilting business. The custom quilters here that I know have more business than they can handle. Maybe you make specialty gear for outdoor enthusiasts. Maybe you make costumes. There are a whole variety of areas of sewing in which you could set yourself up to do custom work or take commissions. The trick with this is to price your work well because, again, you are offering a skilled service. And you may get someone who comes to you and says, I want a custom tote bag. And you give them an initial design, or they give you an initial design and you make one. And they say, well, I like that, but could I have this or could I have that? And then you make another one. Well, it'd be really nice if it had this feature or that feature. And the next thing you know, you've made 8 prototypes and they're still not happy with the finished item. Another way to make money from sewing is to set up an online shop. And again, there are a variety of ways to do this. Maybe you set up an online shop with items that you've made, or maybe you set up an online shop for your patterns. But you could also set up an online shop where you're selling sewing supplies. When I was working on my interfacing class and I was having such trouble sourcing interfacing, I thought I ought to just open up a store. I should open a store and it's going to be just interfacing. That's all I'm going to sell. And I'm going to have great descriptions and great photographs and lots of guidance for people. And then I thought I need somebody to hit me upside the head with a 2x4 because I don't have time to do this. But that's how a lot of online stores get started. They're started by somebody who went looking for supplies and couldn't find them and decided to open a store where they specialize in lace trims, or they specialize in elastics, or they specialize in bra making supplies. You could go in 100 different directions with this. The drawbacks are, do you have storage space for all of these supplies? And do you have time to be filling orders? Can you do it in such a manner that it's streamlined and it doesn't take you a lot of time to fill orders and get packages ready for the post office or UPS or however you're shipping? Do you live close to a drop-off point, or will your mail person pick up all of your packages? These are all logistical questions that you have to answer. But, I think of Nancy Zeman, who started Nancy's Notions back in the 90s, and it began in a basement that she outgrew, and then a garage that she outgrew, and then a shed at or a building at her in-laws' house that she outgrew, and it just kept growing and growing and growing until eventually she had a warehouse. So depending on whether or not you have the logistical setup to make this work, this can be a great option. Let's talk about content creation. A lot of people think that all you have to do is start a YouTube channel and the money will start rolling in. And same thing with podcasts. Maybe for some people that works, and I think in the early days of YouTube, there were probably quite a few people that could do that, but as more and more people enter that arena, the amount of revenue that's available tends to decrease. But certainly, if it's done well, content creation can generate some revenue. I find it amusing sometimes when I tell people about my podcast, the first question out of their mouth is, who sponsors you and how much money are you making? And I'm not in this to make money. If I really needed to make a lot of money, I would probably do something like an Etsy store or an online store. I just am fortunate to be at a place in my life where I can do some things without worrying about the price tag attached to them or what I'm going to get back in terms of monetary compensation. I do this podcast because I enjoy doing this podcast, and it fits into the lifestyle that I have right now. I am balancing a lot of different things. I'm running a construction company. I teach. I do the podcast. I'm homesteading. I'm growing plants and taking care of chicks. So I'm not at a place right now where I could devote 100% of my energy to a money-making venture other than the construction company, because that's our primary money-making venture. And that's the primary reason why I haven't gone out looking for sponsors or tried to monetize the podcast in any way. I've kicked around the idea of starting a Patreon and having a special members-only podcast, but honestly, some weeks it's hard for me to get the one podcast that I'm doing recorded and posted, so I don't want to take on anything else. That's just where I am in my life. Other people may have different priorities and different needs. But if you decide to be a content creator and you decide to start a podcast or a YouTube channel, I would just say you don't need fancy equipment, but you do need good equipment. And again, you're holding yourself out there as a bit of an expert, or definitely an expert in an area, and you need to make sure that you are giving good information. You need to make sure that if you are showing sewing techniques on video, that you do things like pressure fabric. I can't tell you how many YouTube videos I've seen where the maker hasn't even bothered to press the fabric. That drives me up a wall. Use best practices. You want to encourage people to be the best that they can be, so don't be sloppy and don't take shortcuts. If you're not sure about something, research it first. I was listening to a podcast yesterday about sewing, and the host made a statement that was clearly at odds with everything that I know about that particular subject. And it wasn't even a difference of opinion about a technique. You know, I do it this way, she might do it this way. It was just a flat out erroneous statement about something. The bottom line with content creation, I think, is that there is just so much noise out there that it is so much harder than it used to be a signal and set yourself apart. Okay, one area that is getting a lot of attention these days is sustainable or recycled sewing. If this is an area that you're interested in, maybe this is something that you'd like to pursue. I don't have a lot of experience with this, but I do know that the people who have turned this into a business often have more work than they know what to do with. And finally, there are all sorts of niche businesses like sewing machine repair, especially vintage sewing machines. We went through kind of a craze from about 2016 to 2020 where people were convinced that grandma's old sewing machine was going to make them wealthy. I think that interest in vintage sewing machines has dropped off a bit since then, but if that's something you're interested in, you could absolutely set yourself up. Some of you may be familiar with Jojo Bazell. I've had Jojo on the podcast twice talking about collecting and restoring vintage industrial sewing machines. So that is definitely a niche, and there is a fair bit of interest in it. Maybe you'd like to set yourself up as a pattern tester. Some companies will pay their pattern testers, some don't. You just have to find out what the terms are. Sample sewing goes along with that. Maybe you find a store that needs a lot of samples. I typically make a lot of samples for our store, but I buy the fabric because then I keep them as my own personal class samples. But there are stores that are willing to pay people to make samples for the store, and the store provides the fabric. You might set yourself up as a technical editor for sewing patterns. Designers are always looking for good technical editors, emphasis on good. It takes a particular skill set and attention to detail to be a good technical editor, but technical editors are worth their weight in gold. I had a great one when I was working on my knitting patterns, and she was worth every penny I paid her. So there are a lot of ways that you can bring in some income from something that you enjoy doing. We do need to talk about the pitfalls, and the biggest one of all is that turning something that brings you joy into a business may suck the joy right out of it. Maybe you enjoy making gifts for your family for Christmas. Are you going to enjoy making gifts or making things like zipper pouches 365 days a year? Maybe not. Or maybe you enjoy creating, but you don't like the administrative and business end of things. And I see that one a lot. Creative people enjoy the process of creating and don't like to get bogged down in the details of invoicing or billing or paying taxes and things like that. And sometimes the business end of things ends up taking over to the point where you no longer have time to do the creative work. Is that a reason not to try to make money from your sewing? No, but it means that you need to recognize that you might have to bring on help for some of these tasks. My husband is really good at what he does, which is pouring concrete foundations, but he will tell anyone who will listen that if he didn't have me running the business end of things, he wouldn't have a business because he doesn't want to have to deal with workers' comp or payroll taxes or certificates of insurance or anything like that. He wants to go out and make money, and he's quite happy to let me track all the pennies because it's something that I enjoy and something that I'm good at. So really, it comes down to finding a niche where maybe you're serving an underserved audience, and it's something that you can either do efficiently, as in production, or you can scale it easily. So let's say you go from making 10 scrunchies a day to making 40 scrunchies a day. And it helps if you can build a repeat or a consistent customer base. So if you're a long arm quilter, maybe you've got a group of quilters that know that they can come to you for their custom quilting. Or you've developed 3 or 4 or however many stores that will hire you to teach classes. I should mention that if you're going to set yourself up as a business, you'll want to look into the requirements for your state. Here in Montana, we have something called an independent contractor registration. My husband has had his for over 30 years. I renew it every 2 years. His comes with a work comp exemption, meaning that we don't carry workers' compensation on him. For my business, I have the independent contractor registration, and that is something that I provide to the stores where I teach so that they don't have to put me on their payroll. A lot of times they'll get audited, and if they have people working for them that aren't on their payroll, they can get into trouble. So my independent contractor registration just lets everybody know that I'm working as an independent contractor and not as a payroll employee. But again, it's going to differ from state to state. I'm of the opinion that you look as professional as you put yourself out to be, so I try to do those things that make me look like I'm treating my business as a business. I have business cards, I have a website, I have a checking account. Those are the things that help me to treat myself and treat my business as a business. Okay, I think we've covered enough ground for today. If you've started a sewing-related business that I didn't talk about, I would love to talk to you and maybe even have you as a guest on the podcast. So don't be afraid to drop me a note. I have a guest form on my website, on the Straight Stitch Podcast website, and you can fill that out. That helps me on the back end keep everything straight. And thank you to everyone who's been sending me suggestions for podcast guests. I really do appreciate it. I'm trying to follow up on all the suggestions. I don't always hear back from people when I ask them if they'd like to be a guest, but I do try to ask every single person who's suggested to me. So thank you for that. Thank you for the reviews that you are leaving on Apple Podcasts. It really does help other people to find the podcast. If you want to leave a comment on the show notes page, the website for the podcast is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. You can use the fan mail feature on Buzzsprout, which I can now reply to. So there are lots of ways to get a hold of me or offer suggestions or feedback. Again, there won't be a podcast next week, but look for me again the week after. And until then, I hope you have a great week or 2 weeks and that you get to go sew something.